The sound of rain hit the windows of Aiko Tanaka's small apartment, marking the rhythm of her insomnia. Outside, the lights of Tokyo twinkled like artificial stars, oblivious to the internal storm that was raging in his mind. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, fingers intertwined and legs trembling. Another night without being able to sleep. Another night trapped in the whirlwind of her thoughts. Since she was a child, Aiko had lived with an invisible weight on her shoulders. Anxiety. Not the occasional anxiety that anyone might feel before a big decision or an important exam, but a persistent, omnipresent anxiety that tinged every moment of his life with the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. His mind was an engine in perpetual motion, generating catastrophic scenarios every second. What if I lose my job? What if my boyfriend really doesn't love me anymore? What if I leave the stove on without realizing it? What if I get something incurable? No matter how hard he tried to rationalize his fears, they always found a way to return, multiplying like shadows in a dark room. That night, as he tried to calm his breathing, he heard a slight creak in the wood of the floor. It wasn't the typical sound of a house settling down, but something more calculated, as if someone was walking very slowly down the hallway. His body tensed. He leaned his head toward the half-open door of his room and strained. His ears silenced. His mind latched onto a logical possibility. Surely it was the wind or the neighbors upstairs. Tokyo was a noisy city after all. But his heart was not convinced. He stood up and walked towards the door cautiously. He peered into the dark hallway. Nothing out of the ordinary, but then he felt a pressure on his chest. A dense sensation, as if the air around him had changed texture. The slight tingle of a presentiment. "Don't be ridiculous, Aiko," she whispered to herself, trying to dismiss the feeling. He went back to his bed and grabbed his phone. It was 2:37 a.m. I couldn't continue like this. The next day, she had an important delivery at her job as an illustrator of children's books. But sleeping was impossible when his mind was playing against him. He closed his eyes and tried to think of something pleasant. The sound of the sea. The wind through the cherry trees in spring. Her friend Hana's laughter when they drank coffee after work. He took a deep breath. And then he heard a whisper. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It wasn't the creaking of wood. It was a voice. Low, almost imperceptible, as if someone was murmuring right behind her. He froze. His body was paralyzed in a state of absolute alert. A shiver ran down his spine. He turned his head slowly, feeling the air become heavier. His eyes scanned the room, but there was no one. However, the feeling of being watched was so intense that it turned her stomach. He jumped out of bed and turned on the light. Nothing. The air was still, as if the room itself was holding its breath. His chest rose and fell rapidly. "I'm losing my mind. Double quotes, he murmured, putting his hands to his face. For weeks now, he had noticed strange things in his apartment. Small details that made her feel uncomfortable, as if the house itself was reacting to her thoughts. If you were afraid of running out of money, your wallet would disappear for hours only to appear in the same place you had left it. If she was afraid of being watched, the door to her apartment would appear ajar for no apparent reason. If she doubted her own sanity, the mirrors reflected her face in a strangely distorted way, as if the image took a second longer than normal to move with her. At first he thought they were just coincidences, mistakes, tricks of the tired mind. But it was increasingly difficult to ignore the feeling that her house was not only sheltering her, but listening to her. She turned on all the lights in the apartment and sat on the couch, hugging her knees. His heart was still pounding. Anxiety could play cruel tricks, I knew. But what I was experiencing now was not just anxiety. There was something else. And the worst of all was that he was certain that if he admitted it out loud, it would give him more power. He couldn't afford it. She stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the reflection of the city lights in the window, her mind treacherously whispering terrifying new possibilities. What if your fear was taking real shape? The night had been long. Aiko didn't sleep a wink. He stayed on the couch until dawn, watching the sunlight slowly filter through the curtains of his small Tokyo apartment. Even though fatigue weighed on his shoulders, a feeling of alertness continued to vibrate in his chest. As if, the moment he let his guard down, something was going to happen. He forced himself to get up and get ready for his day. A strong coffee, a little makeup to hide dark circles. He tried to convince himself that what happened the night before was nothing more than a product of insomnia and accumulated stress. But when he looked for his wallet to leave for work, it wasn't where he had left it. He frowned. He perfectly remembered putting it on the table with the keys before going to sleep. But now it wasn't there. She checked the kitchen, her purse, the pockets of her coat. Nothing. His heart rate accelerated. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He couldn't afford to be late to the publisher, especially on the day he had to deliver his illustrations. Focus, Aiko. Think. The day before she had been worried about her financial situation. His bank account was not in the best shape, and the uncertainty over the next few months' payments had caused him crippling anxiety. And now, his wallet was gone. He stood still for a moment. An idea crossed his mind like a cold bolt of lightning. No, it can't be. Almost fearing the answer, he turned slowly towards the living room table, and there it was, right in the same place. I swore I looked a minute ago. His skin crawled. I couldn't have missed it. It wasn't there before. The throbbing in his temples intensified as he reached out and took the wallet with trembling hands. His fingers were cold. It wasn't the first time something like this happened. In recent weeks, he had noticed other strange details, small anomalies that seemed to respond directly to his fears. Last week, after reading about robberies in his neighborhood, he had felt a suffocating paranoia. During the night, he woke up to the sound of a faint click on his front door. When he got up to check, he found the door ajar, despite having locked it. 2 days later, as he looked in the bathroom mirror, a thought crossed his mind. What if I'm losing my mind? At that moment, his reflection wavered. A subtle, almost imperceptible delay, as if the image took a second longer than normal to imitate your movement. Aiko blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. It was my imagination. That's what she told herself. He forced himself to believe it. But now, the wallet. It was as if her own house was reacting to her anxiety. As if the atmosphere of the apartment was impregnated with his thoughts and responded to him. He felt a chill run down his spine. He took a deep breath and shook his head, trying to get those thoughts out of his mind. I had to go to work. He had to move on with his life. She put on her shoes, grabbed her purse, and left the apartment with one last uneasy glance at the door before closing it behind her. The day passed normally at the publishing house. No one noticed his tiredness, or at least no one mentioned it. He completed the delivery of his illustrations and attended a meeting with his editor. But throughout the day, one persistent thought tormented her. If the house is really responding to my fears, what will happen if my anxiety continues to increase? He tried hard to divert his thoughts, but the latent fear remained in his chest, like a shadow clinging to his skin. When night fell, Aiko returned to her apartment. He cautiously opened the door and turned on the lights. Everything was in its place, but the feeling was there. That slight tickle on the back of your neck. That irrational certainty that something or someone was watching her. He headed to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and let the cold water run through his fingers. He needed to clear his head. He looked in the mirror. Her reflection looked back at her, with the same tired eyes, the same tense expression. Nothing strange. He sighed and turned off the faucet, but when he looked again, his reflection smiled. Aiko felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. He hadn't smiled, but his reflection does. A second later, Everything returned to normal. His image in the mirror was exactly as it should be. But she had seen it. I had seen it. His heart was beating so hard that he felt like he was going to faint. He breathed heavily and backed away slowly, turning off the bathroom light. I couldn't continue ignoring him. Something was happening in that house. Something I couldn't explain. And the worst of all was that he had the terrible feeling that the more afraid he felt, the stronger he became. The reflection in the mirror, the smile that wasn't his. Aiko couldn't sleep that night. She sat on her bed with her legs hugged, feeling how her mind dragged her into spirals of uncontrollable thoughts. The image of his own face smiling without his permission repeated in his head like a disturbing echo. But there was something else. Something deeper, older. A feeling buried in the depths of his being, like a root tangled in the dark earth of his past. And then, the memories began to emerge. When Aiko was 5 years old, her world was small and fragile. He lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Tokyo with his mother, a woman with a stern face and a soft voice, but full of constant warnings. Don't touch that, you could get sick. Don't talk to strangers, there are bad people everywhere. Don't run so fast, you could fall and hurt yourself. For as long as he could remember, his mother had been his shadow. An omnipresent presence that taught him, with every worried glance and every hand held too tightly, that the world was a dangerous place. And Aiko learned her lesson. Every step out of his house was taken with caution. Every unknown person was viewed with suspicion. Every change in routine caused a knot in his stomach. Fear became their native language. But there was one day that changed everything. It was a warm summer evening when it happened. Aiko and her mother went to a festival at a nearby shrine. The lights of the lanterns illuminated the smiling faces of the children, and the aroma of freshly made takoyaki wafted through the air. For a moment, Aiko allowed herself to enjoy herself, holding a small kitsune mask in her hands. She took a few steps away from her mother, intoxicated by the excitement of the music and laughter around her. But when he turned to look for her, his mother was gone. The air became thick in his throat. His eyes scanned the frantic crowd. Too many people. Too much noise. Her little heart was pounding, and fear paralyzed her. He felt a weight on his chest, a sensation that, many years later, he would recognize as the beginning of an anxiety attack. "Mom!" Her voice was a muffled whisper amidst the noise. The lights became too bright. The voices too loud. Tears fell down her face as terror enveloped her like a suffocating fog. He ran aimlessly, crashing into unknown bodies, hoping to see the familiar figure of his mother. But every step she took made her feel smaller, more lost. Then someone grabbed her arm. It was an old man in a blue yukata. His face was kind, but Aiko only felt panic. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" He wanted to scream, but fear closed his throat. "Send!" His mother's voice cut through the air like thunder. When he turned his head, he saw her, standing with a pale face and wild eyes, as if he had just seen the worst of tragedies. Aiko tried to run towards her, but her mother got there first. He held her so tightly that her arms hurt. "What were you thinking? How could you stay away from me?" Aiko trembled. Her mother shook her lightly. There was no tenderness in his gaze, only fear transformed into fury. "Never, ever do that again." Aiko nodded, heartbroken and guilt deep in her chest. That night, instead of comfort, he received silence. Her mother did not hug her. He didn't tell her that everything was fine. The only thing left was the feeling that the world was even more dangerous than he had imagined, and that she, for a moment of carelessness, had been on the verge of disappearing into it. Aiko twitched. He returned to the present with a tight chest. He put his hands to his face and let out a shaky breath. Now I understood it. She had spent her entire life trapped in the same feeling of that festival. Lost, alone, expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. Her mother's overprotectiveness had not made her safer. On the contrary, it had turned her into someone incapable of trusting the world. His anxiety was no accident. It had been shaped, cultivated by years of inherited warnings and fears. And now, that fear was reflected in his own home, because if he had learned anything over the years, it was that thoughts didn't just exist inside the mind. They were demonstrating, they took shape. If his home was amplifying his fears, then the worst was yet to come. Aiko could barely breathe. The air seemed thick, as if the office had shrunk in size and was crushing her from every angle. His fingers trembled as he tried to stack some sketches on his desk, but the lines of his own illustrations seemed to move under his gaze. The voices around her became distant, as if she were submerged underwater. He had had difficult days, but never like this. It wasn't an isolated event that brought her to this point. It was the accumulation of sleepless nights, the nagging feeling that her home was growing more hostile with each passing day, and the burning fear that something or someone was stalking her, even if she couldn't explain it. Then, his chest constricted. A stabbing pain in the center. His breathing became erratic. "I'm going to die." It was the only thing he could think of. "Aiko, are you okay?" Hannah, her co-worker and best friend, had leaned over her desk with a frown. "No, I can't breathe." "Calm down, breathe with me." But Aiko couldn't. His lungs refused to function. His vision became blurry. Hannah didn't hesitate. He took her by the hand and led her out of the office. Minutes later, Aiko was in the passenger seat of a taxi, her head between her knees, while Hannah spoke to her in a low voice. "I'll take you to someone, a therapist. He is a good man. It will help you." Aiko didn't protest. "I didn't have the strength." Dr. Matsuda's office smelled of soft incense and ancient wood. Aiko sat in a comfortable chair, with a glass of hot tea in her hands. She didn't dare look at the man in front of her. "Hannah told me you had a panic attack at work." Dr. Matsuda's voice was slow, unhurried, unpressured. Aiko nodded slowly. "Is this the first time?" He wanted to say yes, but he knew that would be a lie. It wasn't the first time his chest closed like that. It was not the first time that fear took over his body with such intensity. It was the first time anyone noticed it. "No," he whispered. "Can you describe how it felt?" Aiko swallowed. "I felt like something terrible was going to happen. As if I were going to die. Like something was crushing my chest." The doctor nodded in understanding. "That sounds like a classic panic attack. The body goes into a state of high alert, believing that there is imminent danger, even though there really is not. It is an exaggerated reaction of the nervous system." Aiko looked down. "I didn't feel safe. But that's normal for me. I never feel safe." Matsuda was not surprised. "Aiko, have you heard of generalized anxiety disorder?" She shook her head. "It is a type of anxiety in which worry is constant, even when there is no real reason to be on alert. Your mind looks everywhere for threats, and when it doesn't find them, it creates them." Aiko felt a chill. "Do you believe them?" "Yeah. Fear seeks evidence to sustain itself." She frowned. "What does that mean?" The therapist rested his elbows on the table and looked at her kindly. "When a person with GIA is afraid of getting sick, their body may begin to manifest imaginary symptoms. When someone fears being betrayed, they will see signs in everyone else's every gesture, even if they don't exist. And when a mind is convinced that the world is dangerous, that danger is beginning to feel real." Aiko completed the sentence. With a small voice, "Your house. The objects that disappeared. The doors that opened by themselves. The mirrors that gave him expressions he hadn't made. It wasn't the house. It was her. She was making everything happen." "Aiko," the doctor said softly, "tell me, what do you fear most?" She felt the blood drain from her face, because the answer was there, clear as day. He was not afraid of strange noises in his house. He was not afraid of open doors or objects out of place. "What I really feared. It was losing my mind. And if his mind had created all that, then perhaps he had already lost her." Aiko took a deep breath before turning the key in the lock. The therapist had told him that he should challenge his intrusive thoughts, rationalize his fears. Fear seeks evidence to sustain itself. But what happened when fear found those tests? The door opened with a slight creak. The air inside his apartment felt thicker than usual, as if the house had been holding its breath in his absence. "It's just your mind. Nothing has changed." She left her bag on the table and turned on the light. The light bulb flickered twice before stabilizing. He took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let that get to her. He walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. His therapist had recommended breathing techniques to calm his nervous system. 5 seconds inhaling, 5 seconds exhaling. But with the second breath, he felt it. A change in the atmosphere. The walls. Aiko felt them move, not with a physical displacement, but with a subtle beat, as if the house were breathing with her. He exhaled. The walls seemed to expand slightly. Inhalant. He felt them contract. He put the glass of water down on the table abruptly. It couldn't be real. He closed his eyes. It's not real. When he opened them, everything seemed normal again, but his pulse was racing. It was anxiety. Just the anxiety. He returned to the living room, trying to distract himself. He turned on his laptop and got to work on his illustrations. Drawing had always been his refuge, the only way to shape his internal world without fear. But then, the light started to flicker. Aiko paused, eyes glued to the screen. Every time he tried to focus on his work, the light swung between dim and bright. He dropped the pencil. Wait. The light stabilized. He took the pencil again. The lights flickered. Again, a chill ran down his spine. He cautiously stood up and walked towards the switch. He turned it off and on. It worked well, but when he looked at his laptop again, his drawing had changed. The line he was drawing had extended on its own, warping the figure into something unrecognizable. His throat went dry. He took the eraser and began to correct it, but just before his stylus touched the screen, the lights went out completely. The apartment was plunged into darkness. His breathing became erratic. He felt around until he found his cell phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the room unevenly. His shadow was projected on the wall, trembling like his own hand. He tried to calm down. It was just a power outage. He decided to go to the bathroom and wet his face. He walked slowly, his muscles tense. When he arrived, he turned on the mirror light. This time the bulb didn't flicker. He sighed with relief. He leaned over the sink and let the water run. But when he raised his head, he saw something that made the air catch in his throat. The mirror was covered in condensation. And on the tarnished surface, there was a message written in shaky letters. "You can't escape." Aiko felt her body freeze. The glass in his hand fell to the ground, and shattered. Fear was an electric current on his skin. He couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Everything inside him screamed for him to run, but his feet were stuck in the ground. And then, the reflection in the mirror moved, but not Aiko. The sound of the glass breaking against the floor continued to echo in his mind. Aiko didn't know how long she spent paralyzed in front of the mirror, staring at those words that shouldn't be there. "You can't escape." At some point, his body reacted. He forced himself to breathe, to take a step back, to leave the bathroom without looking back. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the couch with the lights on, his back rigid and his eyes fixed on the bathroom door, as if waiting for something or someone to come out of there. When dawn stained the room with its grayish light, Aiko made a decision. "I couldn't continue like this." "I swear, did he appear alone?" Hana frowned at her, her sushi chopsticks suspended in the air. They were in a cafe near work. Aiko had agreed to meet her friend after canceling the session with Dr. Matsuda. I didn't want to talk to a therapist. She wanted to talk to someone who knew her. "I didn't write it," Aiko answered in a dull voice. He appeared in the fogged-up mirror. Hana put the chopsticks on the tray and rested her elbows on the table. "Okay. Wait. You've said that things are disappearing in your house lately. that doors open by themselves, and that lights flicker when you try to relax. And now this. Aiko nodded slowly. Hana watched her in silence for a moment, and then said, "Have you heard of psychokinesis?" Aiko looked at her, confused. "About what?" "Psychokinesis. It is the idea that the mind can influence the physical environment without direct contact." Aiko twitched. "Do you mean moving things with your mind?" Hana shrugged. "Not exactly like in the movies, but there are studies that suggest that intense emotions can affect the outside world." "That's absurd." Hana leaned forward. "It is? Think about it. You have been under an extreme level of anxiety. It's not just that you feel afraid. Your fear manifests. That sounds paranormal. It doesn't have to be. There's a term for this: unconscious psychokinesis. Some theories say that when repressed emotions cannot find an outlet, they can be physically expressed. Aiko crossed her arms. "That doesn't explain the things that have happened." "Of course," Hana insisted. "Haven't you noticed the pattern?" Aiko remained silent. "When you fear running out of money, your wallet disappears. When you feel like someone is stalking you, the door opens. When you doubt your sanity, mirrors distort your reflection." Aiko felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying I'm making all this happen myself?" Hana took a sip of her tea before answering. "I say it's a possibility. If your anxiety is so strong that your own body reacts with panic attacks, why couldn't it affect the environment around you?" Aiko bit her lip. I didn't want to believe it, but a part of her knew it made sense. "It's crazy," he murmured. "Is it crazier than thinking that your house is cursed?" Aiko didn't respond. Because deep down, I didn't know which option was worse. If his fear was really altering reality. So there was no escape, because the enemy was not in his house. It was inside her. That night, Aiko felt that something was going to happen. He had tried to follow Hana's advice, to rationalize what was happening at home. But the conversation had only planted a more terrifying idea in his mind. If everything that happened was a product of his fear, then he couldn't run away from it. He prepared himself for sleep with a feeling of restlessness weighing on his bones. He forced himself to follow a routine. He washed his face, brushed his teeth, checked that the door was closed properly. But when he turned off the light and got under the covers, something changed. The air in the room became colder. And then he heard it. A whisper. "Aiko, don't go out." Fear hit her with the force of a wave. His muscles tensed. His throat closed. It was a real voice. Not in his mind. Not your own anxiety. Someone or something had spoken to him in a barely perceptible tone, but enough to chill his blood. Her first instinct was to hide under the covers, like when she was a child. But then, he remembered. Anxiety exaggerates threats. He inhaled. He expired. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, an echo of his thoughts manifesting in his own mind. But then, something else happened. A soft, slurring sound, like the rubbing of bare feet against the wood of the hallway. Aiko's eyes snapped open. His heart hammered in his chest. No, it couldn't be real. But the sound continued. Past. Drag. Past. Drag. Getting closer. Primal terror took hold of her, immobilizing her. But then, out of nowhere, his mind played Dr. Matsuda's voice. Anxiety looks for evidence to sustain itself. What you think you see and hear is not always what is really happening. Aiko squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't let fear control her. He took a deep breath and forced himself to move, to reach for the lamp on his bedside table. The click of the switch echoed like a pun, like a gunshot in the darkness. Light flooded the room. And there it was. In the hallway. A shadow. Aiko felt her breathing stop. It was not a defined human figure. It was a dark silhouette, a vague, distorted presence that seemed to absorb the light around it. He had no face. It had no clear shape. But I was looking at her. Or at least that's what it seemed like. Aiko felt her thoughts fall apart. Was it real? Or was it his fear taking shape? But then, the shadow moved. He vanished into the darkness of the hallway without a sound. As if he had never been there, Aiko didn't dare to move. She sat on her bed with the light on, shivering until dawn. Aiko sat on her bed until the sun began to turn the sky pale. His body was exhausted, but his mind was still stuck on the image of the shadow in the hallway. Was it real? Or just your fear giving shape to something non-existent? He had lived with anxiety his entire life, but it had never felt as tangible as it did now. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting for her to look straight at her. He took a deep breath and forced himself to stand up. I couldn't continue running away. Not this time. The hallway was dark, but Aiko didn't turn on the light right away. He stood in the doorway of his room, staring at the place where the shadow had been. It seemed empty, but I could feel it. The house had a different weight, as if it had been holding its breath. Aiko took a step forward. His heart was pounding, but he didn't let himself stop. Each step into the darkness was a challenge against her own mind, against years of living dominated by fear. When she reached the center of the hallway, she stood still. Wait. But this time, there were no whispers. There were no footsteps crawling on the ground. There was no shadow. Just her. He took a deep breath and reached for the switch. The light in the hallway flickered on. There was nothing there. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something new. A void where fear once lived. Not the absence of fear, not entirely, but its weakening. He leaned against the wall and let out a long, shaky breath. He had faced his fear, and the house, as if it knew it, stopped whispering. For the first time in years, his anxiety seemed to subside. Aiko closed her eyes and smiled. Small, faint, but real. The house was silent. For the first time in months, Aiko could hear her own breathing without the invisible weight of murmurs surrounding her. She sat at the dining room table with a cup of hot tea in her hands, letting the steam caress her face. He had faced his fear, and the house had responded calmly. It was never haunted. She whispered to herself. He had always believed that the problem was in his environment, in his home, in the city, in the circumstances. But now he understood it. The house was not the problem. The house was a reflection of his mind. The whispers, the shadows, the half-open doors. They had not been supernatural manifestations, but projections of his own internal chaos. Every time her anxiety enveloped her, the house responded. Every time her fear got the best of her, the whispers grew louder. Aiko closed her eyes. She had spent her entire life feeling trapped, believing that the world was a constant threat, that something terrible was always about to happen. But the truth was that his fear was what gave power to the house. The problem was not outside. It had always been inside. Later that afternoon, Aiko decided to do something she had avoided for years. Open the boxes from her childhood. She had left them piled in a corner of her room since she moved in alone, not daring to look at them. But now he felt like he had to do it. He knelt on the floor and opened the first box. Inside, he found old toys, faded photographs, birthday letters, and a notebook of children's drawings. His fingers ran over the worn cardboard cover before opening it. The pages were filled with clumsy, colorful figures. His mother, his childhood home, his childhood dog. But then, on one of the final pages, his breathing stopped. There was a drawing of a hallway, and at the end of that hallway, a shadow identical to the one he had seen at home. Without defined shape, faceless but unmistakable, Aiko felt a chill run down her spine. I had made that drawing when I was about 6 or 7 years old, long before moving into this house. Long before I knew what generalized anxiety disorder was. Long before his fear had a name. With his throat dry, he looked at the date written in his clumsy childish handwriting in the corner of the page. That particular night. He remembered it. It had been the night he got lost in a shopping center and didn't find his mother for almost an hour. The first time he felt fear so intense that he thought he would die. The first time she felt the absolute panic of being alone in the world. Had the shadow been with her since then? Aiko closed the notebook slowly. I didn't feel terror. I didn't feel anguish. Just a deep and strange certainty. The shadow was not a ghost. It was his fear. He had always been with her. But now she knew she could live without him. And for the first time in her life, that didn't scare her. The sound of cardboard sliding against the floor filled the house. Aiko placed the last box next to the door, feeling the symbolic weight of each object she kept. He was leaving, after years of living in that house, after nights full of whispers and shadows, after facing herself. Was leaving not as an escape, not like a desperate escape, but as a choice. List? Hana asked from the entrance. Aiko looked at her friend and nodded with a serene smile. List. Months had passed since that night when he faced his fear. He was still in therapy with Dr. Matsuda. I still had moments of anxiety, some nights. His chest still tightened for no apparent reason. It was still difficult for him to trust in calm, in the absence of danger, but now he understood her anxiety. She didn't see her as a monster that tormented her, but as a part of her that needed attention, but not control. Dr. Matsuda had explained it well. We cannot turn off anxiety as if it were a switch, but we can learn to live with it without letting it dominate us. Aiko had learned to detect her catastrophic thoughts before they became a storm. He had learned to ask himself, is this real or is this just my fear talking? She had learned to breathe, to stop, to remind herself that she was not in danger. He had learned to respond to himself with compassion instead of fear. And now, she was ready to close this chapter of her life. The front door was open. The wind gently moved the curtains, like a silent goodbye to the house that had contained her for so long. Aiko looked at the bare walls, the wooden floor, the staircase that she had climbed so many times with her heart in her throat. Wasn't afraid. That thought surprised her. I wasn't afraid. She didn't feel like the house was holding her back. She didn't feel like something dark was watching her from the shadows. For the first time, I felt like the house was at peace. Or perhaps, for the first time, she was at peace. He took a deep breath. He let the air fill his lungs. And then, he took the last step. He crossed the door, and he didn't look back. Fear is a shadow that follows us everywhere. Sometimes it's a whisper in the dark. Sometimes it is a feeling that clings to the chest, a constant alarm that we cannot turn off. Aiko spent much of her life running from her fear. I felt it in every step, in every decision, in every thought that strayed towards the worst possible scenario. But when she finally stopped and looked him in the face, she discovered something that changed everything. Fear was not an enemy. It was just a part of her, a voice that tried to protect her, however wrongly. And when she stopped resisting, when she decided to listen to him without letting him dominate her, the shadow lost its power. Now think about yourself. How many of your fears are real? And how many are projections of your mind, fueled by years of doubts, insecurities, and past hurts? Anxiety makes us see dangers where there are none. It makes us believe we are trapped when in reality the door has always been open. It makes us live in a house of whispers, where every shadow seems a threat. But the truth is that the house is not haunted. The danger is not always real. We only shape it with our thoughts. Now I ask you, if your fears shaped your reality, what would your world be like? Would it be a dark place, full of invisible threats and dangers? Or could you start building a space where the shadow no longer dominates you? Aiko decided to face her fear. Now it's your turn. What will you do with yours? Aiko's new house was small, but cozy. The walls were freshly painted a light shade. The windows let in the morning light, and the floor creaked softly under his footsteps, but not in an unsettling way. It felt different. Lighter. More yours. He had only been living there for a few days, but he was already getting used to the absence of the old whispers. to the peace of a place that did not react to his fears. Every night when he lay in his new bed, he felt a kind of calm that he had never experienced before. The silence no longer threatened her. It no longer filled him with thoughts of imminent danger. Simply era. That night, Aiko made a cup of tea and sat on the couch with a book. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. Because now I could do it. Before, in the other house, his mind never allowed him to relax enough to enjoy something, so every day. He was always on alert. Always expecting the worst. But now the tea was warm in his hands, and the words of the book flowed uninterrupted by anxious thoughts. When he finished reading a couple of chapters, he put the cup on the table and stood up. He walked through his home, turning off the lights one by one. At the entrance, he paused for a moment and looked around. The space was dark, but it didn't feel threatening. There were no shadows in the corners. There were no doors ajar. There was nothing stalking her, just her. She smiled to herself and turned off the last light. The room was plunged into darkness. And then, he heard a whisper, a slight, almost imperceptible sound. Like a breath trapped in the air, Aiko froze. His heart skipped a little, but not like before. Not with the panic of someone who believes they are in danger, but with the doubt of someone who he no longer trusts his own fears. The whisper was not repeated. There was no movement in the shadows, only silence. Aiko took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. Maybe it had been the wind, maybe your imagination, or maybe some shadows never completely disappear. But that didn't scare her anymore. He sighed and went to sleep. And the house remained calm.